All right. It's a beautiful Thursday afternoon in Hawaii and later wherever else you are in Vancouver. I suspect it's almost tipping into darkness. And we are in Satsang today. And so I thought today we'd start out with a little. I have a question that Ron Ario brought in, and so I'm going to wander into that question. And I thought I would start out with a little bit of a prep piece, and then we'd handle his question. And so one of the questions I got this week from somebody, and it was kind of an interesting question, and it was the question is, why do they call our life an illusion and refer to it as a dream? And I think for the Western mind, that's kind of a hard, always a hard question. But let me attempt to explain to you what the pointer is and why that gets utilized, so that as people throw this kind of terminology around, or they throw this example around, you'll know what's up. We all start, in essence, in an assumptive state. And what that means really is that through our conditioning, we are taught some basic things. We start as pure awareness, then consciousness springs into action, and consciousness in its raw and completely undefined form. And then we have duality, which is space and time. And into duality, things arise. And we cognize those things through our body mind, which means we have the faculties in our body mind to look out into duality and figure out that there are different things and contrast them one against the other. And that's all duality means, by the way. Duality is space and time in which separation is manifested or displayed or revealed, if you want to use that term. So that's what it is. But then, because we have this wonderful gift, Ramesh used to call it the dubious gift of intellect, we assume that we are a separate entity, that we are what it is we are seeing in manifestation. The body mind that has the intellect, the body mind that does the perceiving, the body mind that does the construction of what the story is on the outside. The cognition, which is the extracting of things, and the creating of the story, those happen. That's a one-piece movement. The extraction and the creation or construction of what the story is. And what we assume is that who we are is that separate body mind. So that's the assumptive state that we live in, right? Now, here's what reality is, and the pointer that we usually use. We will usually say what you are is consciousness, in terms of what you have a sense of, and that you have a sense of existence. That sense of existence, I know I exist, if you want to use that terminology, or I know there is a sense of existence, or there's a felt sense or perceived sense of existence. That's the one thing that we know. And then we do the cognizing and the story building. And so a lot of people will then say, and all of the rest is interpretation. And you can see why they would say that. Because it's the extracting of what is, it's the assigning it to a story, and it's believing in that story or identifying with that story. That's the rest of what happens in the manifestation as we see it. So what we do is we conflate. One of my favorite words. The other day I was talking to Ron, and he used the word cacophony. He says, that's a word I hardly ever use. And he said, I had to go look it up to make sure I was using it right, but it came out of his mouth. And so some years back, the word conflation came out of my mouth, and it was the same experience. I had to go, never used that word before. I think I know what that means. I better go figure it out. But what conflation is taking an experience and melting it all into one thing. So what we do is we melt our sense of experience, our sense of existence, knowing we exist, and we attach it to the stories. And we say, I am the story. That's the conflation I talk about. So when you talk about story identity, you're talking about the identity of the story. So there's a quote unquote Allen story. The Allen body mind can look out there, it can assemble everything. It can say, oh, there's a body called Allen, and that Allen I can see as a story. I actually make the story up. I can tell you what smells the Allen body mind likes and what smells he doesn't. All sorts of interesting things that all make up what we call the story identity. But actually, the story is completely rendered by intellect. It's extracted by the senses, served up to the intellect, which immediately storyfies it, and assumes that we are an entity. It entifies it as well. So that's the state of Maya, or the state of the mistaken identity that we live in. We conflate that sense of existence with that. Now, here's a really great way to look at it. And I'm going to go back to the dream part now. Think about when you have a dream. When you are in the dream state. Now, I want you to know that the dream state and the state of reality manifested is exactly the same thing. To actually differentiate them is to play into our assumption that somehow or another a dream is different than reality. But think about it. When you're in a dream and you awaken from that dream, you immediately recognize that you were there for real. You know that. You know there is no difference between how you were in that dream and how you are when you have awoken from the dream. No difference whatsoever. So all that has happened in the dream is that the sense of existence has been conflated or assigned to the story that's in the dream. And then you say the dream is then the story that I lived. And that's the same thing that's happening right here and now. It's the same I exist, assigned to or connected to or attached or actually enlivening, if you want to actually use that term. So when I talk about walking into the front end of the story and walking out the back end of consciousness, that's what I'm talking about. We know that consciousness, which is just the sense that we exist, that part of it, is at the back end of the story. It's where it starts. And we know at the front end, we have a completely constructed story. And we know that the reclaiming of who we are, one of the ways to do that is just to see that you are a story. Other people use the term concept, that you are a concept. You'll hear that as well. So when somebody says that life is like a dream, that's what they're talking about. They're not saying they're exactly the same thing. You awaken from one and into the other. But if you think about it, do you really feel any differently in one versus the other? They're exactly the same. They feel exactly the same. So in that particular essence, that is what the spiritual folks are talking about when they compare our life to a dream. What they're telling you is that we live in a mistaken identity, and you can find that mistaken identity in a dream or in real life. The same set of mechanics are happening seamlessly and incredibly fast. I want you to know. Here's kind of an interesting fact, and I'll come back to this in a minute as well, that scientists have figured out that activities that a happening occurs, and then in a very small fraction of a second is when we actually assign the story to it and assign ourselves or any of the causes as the causes. That's done after the fact. Now that's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? So the happenings occur, and the way that we feel about it, which is I caused that, or I can see what caused that, that gets added in actually after. That's the story part of it. So the story comes in after the happening itself. Now that's a lot like I like to use the example of our sight. When you look out there, I don't know if you realize it, but the ocular nerve basically pulls in whatever's out there and displays it on the back of your ocular area. I don't know what that is. Justine's not here, no anatomy for me, but at any rate, and it gets displayed upside down. The way that we actually on board or perceive the outer world is upside down. And then our brain takes it and turns it right side up. So, so that's how the right-sided world actually appears. It's a automatic conversion that happens with our brain. Cognition happens exactly the same way. It's an automatic thing that happens, and causality, that happens within our mind as well. By the time you assign the cause, the event and the happening is already over. So so when you look at yourself, pure awareness, consciousness, not in action, consciousness in action, and then of course all of the construction and assigning and identifying that happen, the assumptive state, the state that I am an independent author of my own existence, that happens in the assumptive state, and it happens instantaneously, the same way that your eyes turn an upside down image into a right side image the minute it enters the ocular process. So that's the assumptive state. And when somebody talks about life being a dream, that's what they're talking about. That the perception in a dream and a perception and manifestation, as you and I would call reality, right? Reality in a dream as though they were something different. The exact same mechanics occur. The exact same sense of existence is there. And the happenings in the dream and in the real world are the happenings in the dream and the real world. Now, what's interesting is you could say, well, wait a minute, things happen in dreams that don't happen in the real world. But who knows? You know, the reality is all we do is story up what's happening there. So to claim that one is more real than the other, based on the fact that some things that seem impossible happen in the dream world, and some things that don't seem that they don't seem to happen in the real world. Travel to India sometime, they'll show you a whole family and category of things that are impossible that happen in the manifestational world. The Western mind has a way of trying to actually eliminate those things so that the real world seems, I don't know, more real, more tangible, if you will. But the tangibility is the same. The perception is the same, and the same process is actually occurring. So the happenings happening, consciousness basically animates all of those happenings. And one of the pointers that we use often is to say that those things happen exactly the way that they can and will happen, and in no other way. The only place that an alternative happening occurs is in the mind. The mind is the only place that thinks, oh, that could happen differently. That could happen differently. It happened the way it happened. Happenings, the manifestation that happens in front of your perception. There's only one possibility. If you go back to the past, you don't say, hey, two things happened there. One thing happened. The past is always the one thing happened. Now, you may argue about what that was based on what it was and who perceived it and how they storied it up. That's a different issue, but the happening itself was the same. So Ron asked me a question, and I thought I would wander into that. So Ron was trying to figure out when you are, ready to sleep and you're ready to rest. How is it that the knowing that you're ready to rest, how does that get translated into resting itself? And this is a little bit out of that same playbook, Ron. The knowing that that you need rest is simply the story part that's happening in your intellect. But your body mind, when it gets tired, there's an internal recognition that tiredness is happening, and then sleep happens when it's available and when it can. If you think about animals, this is a really good, now there's two ways to look at this, just so you know. You can look at your body mind as simply being lived into every moment by consciousness, and just go, oh, there's just that direct living. So the sense of being lived into the moment is that sense. and it kind of skips a step that Ramesh used to like to put in there. I kind of like that one. I'm like, look, living happens. You story it up when it's all done. Ramesh would have said, hey, the body mind is like a computer, and every computer comes in its original myth story. In other words, it's built a certain way, and that certain way gets conditioned in only the way that it can, because whatever happens is only going to happen in the way that it happens. There's only one possibility of the behavior. And so all of the thoughts, all of the responses, and all of the internals are always going to be completely predictable, if you will. They're only going to happen one way. And so if it is that in the mind you say, I need to go to sleep now, and that actually is what makes the sleeping happen, then Ramesh has that kind of covered. He would just say, hey, your body mind has been programmed in the only way that it can, and it knows when the sleeping needs to happen, and it's the only way that it can happen. And that's consciousness having programmed you as a computer, and then said, go live your life in the only way that it can be lived. And there's only one way that it can be lived, and there you go. So the reaction to sleep is needed, sleep happens, there you go. My version, the one I tend to like, is that sleeping happens. If a dog is tired and it needs sleep, it doesn't do an intellectual dance about, gee, I need to be refreshed. What about 9 a.m.? It lays down and it sleeps when sleeping needs to happen. And humans do that in much the same way. Now, the programming in you may say, I need to wait till 8 o'clock. And then that programming happens. And then 8 o'clock is when the sleeping then happens. But remember, what you are is not that story. In other words, the story of Ron taking a sleep and the consciousness that you are two different things. So the question that you're asking, which is, how do I know? How does the story know when it needs to go to sleep? That's actually living in your intellect. That's the only place that lives. And I'm responding by talking about that story and trying to point to the fact that consciousness itself is making that happen, right? In whatever way you want to dream up. Because I gave you the difference between Ramesh and my version. That difference is just the story as well. So the one thing, whenever you hear pointers, it's always going to be, it's just a different, that's the story that is attempting to point to that consciousness lives itself into being, right? So think about, a lot of times I talk about that little clip I used to see in the Family Guy, and he's walking along and he has 3 wishes. This genie comes down and gives him 3 wishes. And one of the 3 wishes that he chooses is that he would like to have theme music. And so every time he starts to walk or move, the theme music will start with him. Of course, the people in the street find that a bit unique and react as you might imagine. A dude walking down the street and he's got his own theme music blaring as he goes. And of course, the theme music in the clip, it's really hilarious because it's never the same. So he has different kinds of theme music, evidently for where he is, his mood, or whatever it happens to be, but he gets theme music. And I like to use that one because I think that's a really nice way of understanding the mind and the story that it creates. The story that you think you are is a lot like the theme music. You walking down the street is going to happen no matter what. You needing sleep and laying down to sleep, that's going to happen no matter what. And so the Ron story, right, is simply the Ron story. It's a story that actually, if you think about it, if we know that you laid down to sleep and it wasn't for a millisecond that you made up the story that said, I decided to sleep, then you know that the sleeping itself, the lying down to sleep, happened, and that the story that said you're the one that created it happened a millisecond later. So it's just like the theme music. Ron's story person is the theme music to what's happening with the body mind of Ron itself. And so when you separate those two things, sometimes it makes it a lot easier. You're not conflating consciousness into the story. And that's why I went through that long and incredibly, probably an overreach, but that's how I did it. And that's the assumed or assumptive state. And so the reason we point to that everything that we ever do is always pointing to that assumptive state. The consciousness yields, the perception of the body mind, the intellect adds the story to that instantaneously. The cognition story continuum, as I call it, which lives inside the space and time continuum. These things are the same thing. Space and time, as Einstein will tell you, are exactly the same thing. They're actually one thing that we have teased into two. And cognition and story is a one move that's been teased into two as well. So so all pointers are always after that. I often use the example when I was very young, in 10 years old, I suspect, and it would get very hot in Southern California in the summers. And I lived in an agricultural area, but there was a little frontage road, and of course it was tarred off. And on days when it would get more than 100 degrees, something would happen that was really, kind of interesting. And you would see the waves of heat just move off of the pavement, or the blacktop, if you will. And it was a most amazing thing to a child of 10 years old. And I would kind of cock my head and go, there's something else going on here. And that's what pointers are intended to do. The whole idea of using a pointer is to say to yourself, I see what it is that I've been taught. I see what it is that supposedly is happening. The mental faculties that I have seem to assign everything into the right place. A car is going down the road, a pig is chasing whatever, whatever it is that you assemble. So that all seems to work. I have a story about it. Now, I notice that people don't agree on those stories, but a story happens. And so all of that is there. And yet, internally, most seekers feel in some way, shape, or form one of two things, typically. Either they feel the misery of bondage, and what that is believing you're the story, and then feeling in bondage. The intuition receives your message that you somehow are not free, because in your consciousness, you know what freedom is. That's your birthright. That's the way that you were formed and came before you started all of this processing and cognizing and all the rest of it. And so what happens is the message comes back and it says something like, mine was, I'm in misery. It can be any of those in any of those kinds of messagings. And then I think the other one is just the knowledge that there's something else going on here and I'm not seeing it. A lot of seekers are driven by just a simple, they look out there and there's an intuition telling them what I see going on, what I'm perceiving doesn't seem to settle out to something that intuitively I would understand as what I am, or what is in terms of the manifestation itself. And so there's these internal kinds of messagings that come from the basic construction of who you are. When I see construction is a terrible word, because consciousness isn't constructed, it simply is. But the recognition of consciousness and the fact that that's what you are broadcasts to the rest of everything else. And when that broadcast is incongruent, then you feel turbulence. And so that second thing, I think, is the first is misery, the bondage and misery. But I think a lot of seekers, their version is, I see that I'm always in turbulence, and yet I know that there's something else going on, and that turbulence is not the case. It's not the case of what it is that's out there. There's a knowing that already exists, that turbulence is not the case. And those two things rub up against each other. And those are the things that drive seeking to happen. Now, think about it. Think about how we attempt to solve most problems. We ask questions Those questions live in the story world. They're intellectually constructed. And then we get intellectual answers to those questions. And we say to ourselves, oh, I have learned. But that I is just simply a figment of your story imagination. It, it, it might have actually shifted in some way that it holds knowledge, but that does nothing to change that fictitious character called the Alan story or the Ron story or the James story or the Satyan story. It doesn't do that. And so there must be somewhere else or somewhere else where the birthright of permanent peace lives. Now I go back because awakening will immediately in its perception inform you that permanent peace is what and who you are. So I'm kind of cheating a little bit when I say that, because as a seeker, typically you know that you're looking for something, but you don't know what. So I cheated and gave you the answer that permanent peace was a birthright of who we are as pure awareness, and that broadcasts through you to inform you that when you are identified with the ups and the downs of life, that you're living in turbulence, and there is quote unquote something else going on here. All right, that's the turbulence. That's the turbulence piece. Okay. All right, here's James. Does the mind perceive pure awareness? If not, who's perceiving and communicate this perception? Okay. So this one gets really fun, James, because ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to say there is a perceiving with no perceiver. And so what you are is pure awareness. It's also what I am, what Ron is, what Satyan is, what everybody is. So pure awareness simply is. And then that pure awareness sees when the pure awareness is a principle in permanent stability and peace, and consciousness is the element of activity. And once consciousness springs out of pure awareness is what is perceiving in consciousness itself. And the mind lives in consciousness. Once the body mind dies, the mind goes with it. And so what the mind does is it takes the perceiving and processes it. That's what the mind does. So the mind does not perceive pure awareness, but pure awareness perceives the mind. So pure awareness is the big piece behind. The mind is the smaller piece out there. And actually there's a lot of conversation to be had about what the mind is, because all the mind really is a container that we use to represent a string of thoughts. So that's one way of saying that the mind is out there. But to assign the mind to only a body mind, one body mind, that's where you kind of get into issues, because it's kind of obvious that many minds have access to the same thoughts. That's where Jung came up with his idea of archetypes, stories that appear again and again and again in separate minds. So there's likely some discussion to be had about whether this string of thoughts appears only in the mind of only in the perceptive capabilities of the body mind, or whether those perceptive capabilities include access to other thoughts that roam around, and lots of individual minds have access to that. But all of that is perceived by pure awareness, right? And so who's communicating this perception? The body mind is. The mind is actually is communicating the perception it receives. And so when the shift of awakening takes place and the perceiving moves back, the recognition is that the perception happens at the point of pure awareness and not within consciousness at the body mind point. Then it is seen that the individual is just a story, right? So So the mind still operates, but here's the difference. The mind operates in the first case as though it were the author of all that exists, and it completely obfuscates uh, any sense that there is pure awareness. However, when it moves into the next place, instead of being the driver, it becomes the navigator, and the mind continues to operate, and it does the reporting out, right? And it says, hey, pure awareness is over here, right? But here's the problem that we run into. Pure awareness can only be experienced phenomenally, and it lives in the pre-verbal state, if you want to use that. In other words, once the reporting happens, it immediately is located in the mind and in manifestation, and it's simply reporting something that it can only point to. So that perceiving without a perceiver, the reporting of it and everything that lives with that only lives in manifestation and only lives in the mind. So it reports out what it can and points back to being itself, right? Pure awareness and being, which we could talk about being as a word and what it connotes, but presence and being live in consciousness, and those live in the pre-verbal state. Those are the things that live. We know that we exist, right? But we can't tell you what existence is. We can be existence, but I can tell you what it is. But the minute I do, I've actually bastardized and pulled it out of what its natural state is. And I'm now telling you something that has been processed. So the best I can do in terms of awakening, is to point to that place itself and hope that you fall in the water, so to speak. So that's the problem with the knowledge world, right? You ask a question, you get an answer, and it seems like it's a right answer, but it all lives in a concept. It all lives in a story. It's in essence been processed, and it no longer in the mind reflects what it really is. The only way to have it as it really is to live in a world with no words and no processing, which is what happens in in awakening, right? All that happens is at pure awareness, the figment of story and imagination that you think you are, that you're identified with, it crumbles, right? The identification, the glue, because I'll still yell at you and go, hey, James, or hey, Ron, and you'll go, what? So the body mind, back to the sleeping, Ron, you sleep. It's the body mind knows that it's supposed to answer. So it receives, it hears the auditory and responds. That happens, right? So you can say that the ego continues to exist. It just exists as a shadow. It's like a shadow government, right? It's seeing that your ego is a shadow self, right? It's just a story that you've created to represent what you see going on out there. And actually, the perception is happening from behind that in pure awareness, right? And that's what happens in awakening. By being identified with the story that you are and conflating your I exist with the story, the I exist never gets a chance to be seen on its own. It's always completely glued to the story identity. And that's why people feel in bondage, or they feel they can't see the real thing, and all of that. Now, if you try to look from the story back, you can't. It's not possible. That story doesn't see anything, right? It only goes one direction: pure awareness to the story, right? To consciousness, through consciousness, and into manifestation. Anything that's in consciousness. That's how the activity actually occurs. Thank you. Great answer. Thank you. It gets funny because, remember, we're always, you can get in a real trap here. I always kind of chuckle because the whole function of a pointer is to point you towards being and to point you towards pure awareness itself. And then you'll hear people argue about pointers. And that was one of the reasons earlier I used Ramesh's version and my version. My version is a much more felt experience version where the sense of being lived into the moment is actually um, a phenomenal experience and awakening. But the intellectual version that Ramesh used to like to use was, hey, look, everything within the body mind is like a computer, and consciousness programs the computer. So the computer can do nothing else but what it does, and what you're seeing is the only thing it can do. And that gives you the same answer. And Ramesh tended to like the more intellectual constructions. He was just a genius in that way. Me, not so much. I tend to like the more felt, experience, tangible, emotional kinds of things. So I use a pointer that points in that direction. He used a pointer that pointed in the mental direction. Could you imagine the idiocy if someone decided they wanted to argue about which of those two things was more accurate? They would be arguing about something that nobody cared. More accurate, what does that mean? If you fall in the pool, you're wet. You don't say, what was the more accurate way? If I give you a kick in the butt and you fall in, and somebody else gives you a kick in the butt and you fall in, you're not going to say, hey, you know what? The more accurate one was the one that was closer to my left cheek. Like, nobody's going to be saying that. What you're going to be saying is, hey, dude, I'm wet. I get it. And that's the thing to see when you're living in pointer land. Don't get caught up in arguing about the truth of a pointer. There is no truth in a pointer. It's not intended to be true. It's intended to induce. It's intended to tease out a possibility that lives there and wants to be teased out. But we're trying to bypass the mind's iron grip on believing that it's the author of what goes on. So it has a tendency to reach out and grab everything it can. Yeah. It's kind of like getting divorced in California and having an ex-wife in the 80s. It reaches out and grabs everything it can. Yeah. So how's that? I probably won't write that in the book. And I'm sure that's politically incorrect on in 100 different ways, but I kind of liked it. It was fun. All right, cool. So that's that particular answer, and that's the reason. Notice by the way, you'll notice this when people talk to you about things. So when that person asks me, gee, can you explain me the dream? Can you explain to me why somebody would call it a dream? Right? I'll give you my answer, but that's a pointer that somebody else really likes to use. I don't use that one, by the way, a whole ton, other than to point out that a dream feels exactly like a real manifested experience. So that if someone is trying to create meaning or something spiritual out of a dream versus real life, I can simply say, look, in manifestation, all there are the contents of your mind, the thoughts and the images and the perceptions that are in your mind. So that's what's living there, and that a dream and a real manifestation occupy the same place in the mental processes. So I'll use it to go there if that's the question. But I'm not a big one in the West, especially. When you hear somebody talk about something being real, well, in the West, what we think is real is if I can pick something up and say, that's real, right? And in the Western sense, we would actually say some things aren't real because you can't touch them, feel them, in some ways perceive them. So that's how the word real gets held in our world. In the East, it's an entirely different proposition. Anything that begins and ends is considered not real. And the only thing that is real is that which always has been and always will be, or actually lives outside of time. It's eternal. It's immortal. And that's what real is in that world. So when somebody talks about a dream not being real, you can see it starts and ends, it arises, right? So in the Eastern sense, you could say that's as fictitious or not real as life itself. But the Western version, when you use the word real, you can get yourself in trouble with that one. So I have a tendency not to use that. Story, on the other hand, we all know what a story is. So, and we all know that when an author writes a story, it would be absurd to think that the characters were living out of some level of freedom and had something to say about what was happening within the script that was written. In fact, actors go and they read the words and they play the part. Now, they may play the part in a slightly different way from however their perception is of the content, but they're not standing around asking themselves if their character in the actual script has autonomous authoring capabilities. They know that's not going to happen. If your character is going to die, if you're in Game of Thrones and your character is going to die, hey, guess what? You're out. And your character does not get to say, hey, wait a minute, time out. I have free will over here and I'm operating within this script and I'm the autonomous author. So I'm going to go to Santa Monica and I'm going to take a course on abundance. And I'm not going to die. I'm going to be the most abundant Viking ever in the Game of Thrones. That's what's going to happen here. And you know what? He gets written off and dies. That's what happens in the Game of Thrones. So in a certain way, that's what life is. We're playing our own Game of Thrones. And the story characters that we are, which can only happen in one way, and based on everything that we construct, we are asking or demanding that we have free will and we're authoring that. Now, this really drives corporate types nuts. I want you to know this. It drives out of their tree. So the most common question from the corporate world is, well, wait a minute. If I work with this internal sense of malaise that I have, am I going to be more wealthy? Am I going to make more money? And I just find that to be one of the funniest questions, because I tell them, hey, listen. If you're built to make money, you're going to make money. And if you're not built to make money, you're not. And if you're kind of in between, yeah, guess what? That's where the action's going to be. So that's what will happen. And it just drives the corporate world crazy. They're driven to do the spiritual journey, but they want it to have a leveraged payoff. You know, how do I leverage my spiritual journey into a life of manifestation where I make more money? It's just the corporate way of thinking. And so that's one of my favorite questions. And of course, all of the abundance stuff that comes with it. And even when people start to talk about non-duality and different states of non-duality, sorry, no such thing. There's pure awareness. It literally has no defining characteristics. It's pure witnessing, and everything else is consciousness. And anything that has a difference from something else lives in consciousness, period. How do you know it's in consciousness? Can you tell it from something else? Can you define it? Can you see it? Can you perceive it as different from something else? It's in duality. It's in the active principle of consciousness. And if you want to call those states, well, then there's billions and billions and billions of states. But that's not non-duality. Non-duality is the perceiving from pure awareness. And there is literally no set of states and no differentiations in that world, period. And that's just simply how it is. And that gets reported out. How will you know that? Well, when you fall in the water, right? I'll try to get my foot where it belongs. How's that? All right. I'm rolling today. Any other questions? Does anybody want to pop a question in here for me to wrestle with before we call this a fun time? I actually didn't go as long as I normally do, but if there is a question left, please jump it in here. I know today was kind of a bit on the technical side for me, huh? So, thank you. Thank you. Aum is the most wonderful thing. Here's the reason I like it, by the way. The Western mind loves words and symbols. And when you're in the East, it's the felt experience. And Aum is the felt experience. It's the first manifestation of consciousness itself. And when you're around Aum, the thing to notice is the felt experience of the moment, here and now. All right. Thank you, everybody. I will see you at the next one of these. And I really, really appreciate it. Sachin, call me sometime. We need to catch up. I love you dearly. And I'll see James and Ron tomorrow. Bye, guys. Much love.